Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to pick up talking about the different land biomes. And keep in mind when we talk about biomes, right, these are geographic areas that have similar climates and similar ecosystems. So when we dive into that ecosystem term, right, we're talking both abiotic as well as biotic factors that are present in that particular environment. Um, so when we look at land or terrestrial biomes, we typically characterize them really by similar communities of plants and animals, and even more so on the animal side of that tends to be even more specific and more concrete because those plants don't move. The animals can move between biomes to a certain degree, right? Think about birds who are migrating, um, other animals that might migrate. So when we look at them, we're really probably focusing most of the time on plants. But that being said, there are definitely animal communities in biomes that are sort of characteristic of that you might kind of think of. Um, so keep in mind when we talk about biomes, right? These are big geographic areas globally, right? Rainforests, deserts, and there are definitely rainforests and deserts and those sorts of environments on multiple continents. So when we look at the characteristics of plants and animals that live in a particular biome, that's going to be pretty much universal, whether we're talking about a desert in Africa or a desert in the Southwest United States, right? Dry, arid conditions, so the kinds of plants and animals that are capable of living there have to have adapted characteristics that allow them to maximize their survival and reproduction given their environmental conditions. So when we look at specific plants and animal species, those may differ from one place on Earth to another, but they'll all have similar niches and all have similar physical and physiological, meaning the way that they function, those characteristics. So when I look at just an example of an animal species, we can talk about the bison or the buffalo here in North America and the characteristics and the niches that they fill. But when we go over to Asia, it's not a bison, it's a yak. But those yaks will also have very similar characteristics in terms of the way that they look and the way that they function, as well as the jobs and the roles that they play within their ecosystems. So although the specific species may be different from one area to the next, the niches and the adaptations that they have in those different environments, different places on the earth would be very similar because of the fact that not only do we characterize biomes by plant and animal communities, but also by similar latitude on earth, which if you go back to the climate discussion, means the amount of average angle of the sun that's hitting Earth at that location is going to be very similar, which then drives into similar rainfall, similar temperature patterns, averages, right? Their climate as a whole. So, am I talking about a temperate forest, in which case we get certain average rainfalls, we see seasons, as opposed to a desert that doesn't get much at all, relative humidity is very low, so on and so forth. And all of that's certainly going to drive then a lot of the other abiotic factors that we see, the soil types, the amount of water present, so on and so forth. So when we look at some of the major land biomes or terrestrial biomes, this sort of just gives you a big overview of the map of where we find most of these types of ecosystems. So again, I can see tropical rainforests here in South America, as well as Africa and Asia, and into the islands between Asia and Australia. So clearly the specific species that are existing in those different tropical rainforests may be different, but the niches, the communities, structure, the soil, the climate, they're all very much on similar latitudes. So we'll see a lot of those similar abiotic factors, which then are driving the adaptations that organisms living in those environments would end up accumulating due to natural selection. So we've got 8 common biomes that are typically taught. The tundra, the taiga, or you may come across it as the coniferous forest, the temperate deciduous forests, tropical rainforests, temperate grasslands, savanna, the desert, and then the chaparral. So I'm going to run through some of the major characteristics of each of these. You could spend hours, days, years studying a particular biome in very minute detail. But our purpose here is just to kind of give you a brief overview, get you familiar with some of the major characteristics to just sort of be able to distinguish one biome from the next. So let's start with the tundra. And when we look at where this typically falls on Earth, this is going to be a pretty high northern latitude, so just around the Arctic Circle or just south of it. And these will have very long winters, usually on average of about 10 months, just because they are at such high latitudes, they don't get a lot of direct sunlight, but that also means that they are very dry. They don't get a whole lot of precipitation up here either. So when you go back and you look at those convection currents that we were talking about in the atmosphere, these are very much sort of winter deserts in the sense that they don't have a lot of moisture here. What they do have is something very interesting called permafrost. So when we look at the soil composition, you get this really thick subsurface layer of soil that pretty much remains frozen almost all of the time. And so that is going to really have an impact on the type of vegetation that can grow here. They can't have super deep roots, and they also have to be able to survive those really long, harsh winters as well. So we see a lot of sort of mosses and lichens and just some very superficial plant species here. So again, a lot of low growing vegetation that has to be adapted to that extreme cold. They don't have a very long growing season, so they really have to sort of sprout, spread their seed, reproduce, and then go dormant again. So we see again a lot of those mosses, lichens, some grasses. It's actually incredibly large amounts of flower variety. Um, Last number I pulled was somewhere on the order of about 400 different varieties of flowers. So when this all sprouts up in the springtime, it is really quite a beautiful sight to see. Lots of different colors and all sorts of things, as opposed to the winter, which is just kind of a white wasteland. Animals. A lot of these guys are migratory, so they will move into the tundra, deeper into the tundra areas when it's a little bit warmer and then sort of move further south during the winter. Um, Definitely have to be able to survive some really cold seasons. Also, not a lot of vegetation. So, when we get to talking about food webs and food chains, they have to be able to manage that. A lot of these are also not only migratory, but hibernating species as well. Well, they'll sort of stock up, pile up all of that sort of fat and calories during times when there is vegetation and then either move further south and or hibernate for certain portions of the year so that they can survive that lack of primary productivity, primary plant matter to feed the rest of the food chain. So when we look at animals here, things like caribou, right? The musk ox, which are up here, things like Arctic hares, so rabbits, voles, which are these guys here, our little lemmings. These guys are all sort of principal herbivores, right? And if you remember that term from somewhere, a herbivore is a plant eater. And then when we talk about carnivores or meat eaters, we get things more like our Arctic fox, snow owls, polar bears, wolves. Those guys are species we might come across here in the tundra. If we move a little bit further south, we get into the taiga or the coniferous forests. And keep in mind that this is going to be a little further down, so still pretty cool. Still talking sort of those northern climates, but we will get a little bit more rain here. But the winters are still pretty long. Summers are still relatively short. We're not going to get crazy amounts of rainfall here, but it will be a little bit more than we would typically see in the tundra. Still short growing seasons, maybe not quite to the point of 2 months in the tundra, but we're still not talking something that we might be used to here where we can get 4 or 5 months sometimes to get things to grow. The vegetation here really is dominated by coniferous trees or conifers, right? So evergreens, trees that produce cones. In the way that these particular plants, trees specifically, grow, they really suck up a lot of nutrients from other plant species. So the soil itself is relatively minimal in terms of its nutrients. So it's mineral poor, we say. It's very acidic um, because these guys aren't dropping regular leaves. They're not dropping a lot of carbon material back to the soil to be able to sort of re-enrich that soil when that decomposition happens. So they are sort of sucking out the nutrients, using them to grow, and not returning a whole lot back. So plants, again, dominated by those trees, evergreens, firs, pines. You may get a few deciduous trees here, but not a whole lot. Most of them are conifers. And then again, we get a bunch of animals, a lot of which may migrate a little bit further up into that tundra during its growing season, and then will often overwinter here. So things like predators like your lynx, weasels, grizzly bears, wolves again, the fox, some other herbivores. We get this snowshoe hares or cute little bunnies here, red squirrels, lemmings, voles, and that sort of organisms again. So you can see some of the lists of those animals definitely overlap in the Tioga, which is why we tend to not focus as much on the animal species in a biome as a characteristic of that biome, as opposed to focusing more on the plants, which aren't going to move on us. Temperate deciduous forests, this is what we're used to. This is where we live. So definitely hot, warm summers, cool, cold winters. We get much more of that distinct seasonality. We have those 4 distinct seasons, or at least we should. So you get enough rainfall to support trees that are capable of producing those leaves and dropping them every year. There's enough nutrients in the soil as a result of that. So we're talking somewhere around rainfall, typically about 30 to 60 inches, depending on where you're at per year. Average temperatures, if we look at the entire 12-month period, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Clearly, we know that that swing can go much colder in the winter and much warmer in the summer, but we see averages somewhere around there, give or take. And so plants, we see a lot of deciduous trees, right? Plants that are going to lose those leaves. Not that we don't have any conifers here, we certainly do. But most of the forests, when we look at these types of biomes, are very much characterized by these specific deciduous trees that exist there. So we talk about oak forests or maple forests or hickory forests. And then animals, you guys are generally probably used to these. So things like our white-tailed deer, the eagles, the hawks, black bears, squirrels, coyotes, just to name a few. We get into the tropical rainforests now, and now we're looking at right in that band of the tropics. So these are very lush forests, and they can grow and grow and grow because of the warm temperatures that are pretty much average. So somewhere between 20 degrees Celsius, 34 degrees Celsius is what we're talking about in terms of warm temperatures. You want to do a really quick conversion to that into Fahrenheit, which is probably what you're more used to looking at temperatures in. Um, Not a perfect conversion, but really quick. If you double the number and add 32, you get pretty close. So if we were to take something like that 20 degrees Celsius, multiply it by 2, we get up to 40 plus 32. So about 72 degrees Fahrenheit on the low end. Um, Abundant precipitation, right? This is where most of that water is being dumped because of those convection currents we looked at in the atmosphere. So anywhere from 50 to up to 260 inches of rainfall a year. That's a lot of water. Um, Also pretty mineral poor soils. Mostly because there's just so much vegetation all the time, it stays green. While it may lose leaves here and there, it's not going to have the same seasonal turnover that we're used to seeing here in the temperate forests. And so organisms have to have adapted to also manage that poor mineral soil again. How do they get nutrients? So we see things like Venus flytraps in areas like this because they will, rather than get most of their nutrients out of the soil, they will actually get it from other organisms that they will trap and break down via enzymes in those plants, which is a pretty cool adaptation to get around the fact that you can't get a whole lot of nutrients out of your soil. Or they'll tap into other plants nearby in order to manage that. This is by far the highest biodiversity on the globe. When we look at tropical rainforests, at least as terms of terrestrial biomes, they have incredibly high biodiversity. What do we mean by that? So when we look at biodiversity, we sort of define it as the assortment or the variety of living things in an ecosystem. So the sheer amount of different plant and animal and insect and bacterial species, just go down through your classification schemes. And the amount of different organisms we find within all of those kingdoms and phylums and classes is just outrageous. So this very much depends on a lot of factors, including the fact that there's lots of moisture here. So, generally speaking, water isn't a major limiting factor, temperatures as well. And when we look at the global historic climate change patterns, and we talk about ice ages and plate tectonics and all of that sort of thing, we get this band here in that tropical region that really never has glaciated, meaning it's never iced over. The polar ice caps have never completely encapsulated Earth, particularly at this region. So, one of the thoughts as to part of why there's so much biodiversity here is because evolution never stopped. So, once life existed, because this narrow band of Earth always remained habitable, there was a lot more time for the species who lived here to work through that natural selection and diverge into different species, which is kind of an interesting thought. Um, so that, in addition to all of these other helpful climate and soil and temperature conditions, has really set up the amount of biodiversity that we see here. And to be fair, there are probably plenty of species that we are not even aware of in these regions. And so the conservation of these regions is incredibly important to maintaining that biodiversity, maintaining their stability, because who knows what we can find there. And we'll dive into some of that discussion a little bit more when we get to that conservation at the end of this unit. Types of organisms we see here, things you may or may not be familiar with. If you've ever walked through a grocery store or a plant store, you may have come across these bromeliads. Right, so these are tropical plants. Epiphytes, orchids are also tropical plants. Strangler figs, bananas, rubber trees, those are all tropical forest plants that we would see. Animals, right, these are some of the fun ones. The toucans, boa constrictors, our cute little spider monkey up here, our cute little baby sloth, right? So just incredible diversity, and this is only scratching the surface of the plants and the animals, not to mention the bugs and the amphibians and all sorts of crazy amounts of species that we find in those tropical rainforests. All right, let's move into temperate grasslands. So they are called grasslands mostly because the vast majority of the plant life here are in fact grasses. We will see some interesting seasonality here, particularly in the sense of having a dry versus a wet season. When we look at grasslands that are more in our typical temperate region, we see most of that wet season being snow. So when we talk about sort of Midwest, Kansas, and that kind of place, those kinds of places here in the US, most of their quote unquote wet season is in fact snow. We go to more tropical grasslands, and then we're talking more rain as their wet season. So things like savannas and stuff like that may also be thrown into those grasslands. Super deep, super mineral rich soils. So when we look at places like Kansas and Iowa, why do we see where those being some of the major farming areas? Because they just have such rich soils to manage that kind of growing. So very much well suited to growing crops, particularly any sort of grassy, grainy crops. So corns, the wheats, that kind of thing. So plants in these temperate grasslands. So we're talking again grasses. You may see some willows, oaks, cottonwoods. So there are some trees here. They're just not as abundant as we would typically think about in a forest. You can see some sunflowers, clovers, lots of different flower species here as well. Um, so very much similar in the sense of that tundra having tons of flowers and lots of low-lying plants. We see something similar in terms of the vegetation here, just different species. In terms of animals, we've got our bison here. Those are pretty common. Our prairie dogs, our little black-footed ferrets, quails are another example, hawks, owls, and again, this is just to name a few. So the savannas are really our tropical grasslands. So again, they're definitely going to have a wet and dry season, but their wet season is going to be mostly rain as opposed to the snow we see in the temperate grasslands. They definitely have some vegetation in terms of trees and grasses, but they tend to be a little bit more patchworked depending on what kind of savanna you look at. So you can see there's a little bit more dirt coverage here, but far out in the distance, there might be a little bit more grassiness. So these will typically occur more in those tropical zones. When we look at the zonation of the globe, won't have a whole lot of rain during that dry season, but it'll be more seasonal rain. So if you've ever seen The Lion King, you know the basics at least of what this looks like. So we've got our acacia trees here. Elephant grasses are another big plant. Boba trees, those really sort of weird, gnarly looking trees. Bermuda grasses, and then your typical animals that, again, if you've seen The Lion King, you know that a lot of the major big mammals, so giraffes, elephants, lions, hyenas, so on and so forth. We get to our deserts, right? And these tend to sit somewhere around 30 degrees north and south latitude because of the way that those convection currents work in the atmosphere. So very dry climates. Days tend to be very warm. But on the flip side, there's not a whole lot of water here and it's just land. So the vegetation isn't there to also hold in the warmth either. So the nights tend to be very cold. So organisms have to be very much specialized to A, deal with those extreme climate changes every day, temperature changes, I should say, every day, as well as to have specialized ways to conserve their water. So when we look at a lot of the plants, probably the first thing that pops into most students' minds are the cactus, right? But we've got yuccas, bristlebrush, Joshua trees, to the point of we have a national park called Joshua Tree National Park in the middle of the desert because there's so many of those trees abundant. When we look at animals, we have things like the roadrunners, our little peccaries here, cute little piggies, the gilly monster, right? The kangaroo rat that I showed you back in that microclimate image, our cute little bobcats. So those are some things that we might be used to seeing here in this type of an ecosystem. Most kids will know the ones that we've talked about thus far, the first 7. Chaparral tends to be one that's a little bit more unusual because it really occurs globally on a very small scale. We see most of this just around the Mediterranean. You don't tend to get this as sort of a big widespread ecosystem, widespread biome. So this is one that isn't necessarily as commonly taught, but we do see them sort of dominated by shrubs, very hot, dry summers. But on the flip side, they tend to have pretty moist, cool winters. So we're sort of sitting somewhere almost between our sort of grassland-esque environment, but a little bit more rocky, a little bit more mountainous, um, and a little less grasses per se, and a little bit more shrubland. So you may also come across these as just shrublands is another term I've heard associated with these types of biomes. So when we talk about plants, buckwheat is something common here. Yuccas, shrub oaks, which are these guys, you can kind of see them here. Sage is another one that's common. And we get some animals that do sort of look similar to some desert organisms as well. So we get those roadrunners, vultures, coyotes, bobcats, um, our little pack rat here. All right, there's that roadrunner. So it is sort of an interesting, unique biome that exists mostly because it's kind of almost a cross between a desert and a grassland in that seasonality that it shares.